unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Roland Allen, who is in publishing at Thames and Hudson, right? You're on the business side, you do sales, you do all sorts of stuff in publishing, but you're also a writer, and you write about writing. And this book is called The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Welcome, Roland.
Thanks very much for having me, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I had absolutely no idea what this book was going to be about. I read a bunch of reviews, said it was awesome. I was like, I got to pick this thing up. And it is, it's a remarkable small work of history that approaches it from a unique angle. We have lots of these sorts of histories. I interviewed Mark Kurlansky, of course, who has written histories of, fish and all sorts of things.
A great writer and a complete role model from the point of view of this kind of book.
Right. But, those things are about phenomenon that are independent of writing, whereas this is really a book about writing and a particular type of writing. And I never really thought of this as a unique genre, right? The idea of a notebook, even though all of us have notebooks, all of us have piles of notebooks. I just concluded a program, an executive program, where we gave every single speaker a blank notebook. And here it is in, 2024, you'd think, and a pen, of course, you'd think people would look at this as some kind of piece of, archaic nonsense, but everyone was sort of, oh, wow, thank you so much for my notebook. And it didn't occur to me until you mentioned it in the book that, there's stationery stores, and there's bookstores. And this is a type of book which, although it may be purchased at a stationery store, might ultimately wind up reproduced and sold in a bookstore. So first of all, I guess, how did you get this idea to think of the notebook as a particular genre worthy of study?
I guess I couldn't put a date on it, but there must have been a day when I suddenly noticed notebooks, and suddenly realized how omnipresent they were, not only in my life, but in everything I saw around me, particularly in the office, but also, I guess, because I'm not a visually creative person myself, but I work in illustrated publishing. So I work with a lot of designers, a lot of artists, a lot of illustrators, photographers. They all use notebooks, the serious ones. I work with a lot of authors and writers, therefore they all use notebooks. And I suddenly noticed them everywhere. And it was like a little switch flipped in my head. And then the next question was, well, they're everywhere. No one seems to notice them. They take them around with them completely routinely without realizing that they're this little invention, that they're not like air or water. Someone had to invent a notebook at some point. And then the next question was, well, where did they come from? That was a much harder question to answer. And that was sort of the next couple of years of my life, sort of really digging around and trying to determine where they first popped up and where they first made an impact.
Well, the whole idea of writing things down that you are thinking in the moment. Obviously this goes back, it's almost as old as writing itself, except that at one point writing required some serious equipment, right? If you were doing like cuneiform, writing was for things that were meant to be permanent at one point. And it really required some technology that enabled you to kind of write on the fly. And this used to be only available to the wealthy, and now it's available to everybody, right? Did this change the nature of
permanence
thinking?
is a really useful concept here, because we were able to write in a non-permanent way, in lots of different ways, for a very long time. So papyrus, for instance, is a very good way to write, and it's a very good way to keep a note for a short while, but it's very far from permanent. It always just falls apart over time. Then you have a wax tablet, which is also a very good way to write. That was Europe's notebook technology probably for about 2,000 years, something like that, was the wax tablet, including the whole Roman era. Again, really good piece of kit for keeping a temporary note, very bad for keeping a permanent note. Parchment then came along, again, really very good for temporary things. The parchment itself will last forever, but unfortunately you can scrape whatever you wrote on it off. So you can't do a contract on a bit of parchment, for instance. You can't do a business record or an agreement because it's liable to be forged very easily or amended very easily. But then paper turns up quite late in the day, and that's permanent. It's really robust, but it's also unforgeable, unfakeable, and then it's also cheap as well. So suddenly people bind it up into notebooks, which they've used, that format they've used for 1,000 years, as the codex, the parchment Bibles and things like that, chronicles, and the sort of ancient illuminated manuscripts that we think of. You put paper in that format, it becomes a notebook, and suddenly it's incredibly useful, and people find all kinds of inventive ways to use them.
Yeah, and of course, this affects the creative process. I mean, you talked about how, I guess it was Cimabue and Giotto were the first ones that had the capacity to do sketches, right? Sort of
Yeah,
just throw off some
exactly.
sketches, and this
Yeah,
completely changed the nature of the visual arts.
yeah, I think so. And it's this is something which I learned from working actually with art teachers and illustrators and publishing people who taught drawing. Um, and the one thing that they always say is you've got to draw a lot. If you want to learn how to paint or draw, you've just got to draw a lot. And they all keep hundreds and hundreds of sketchbooks. Any serious artist you meet will have absolutely shed loads of them. So from a practical point of view, it seems really obvious. From an art and historical point of view, it's a little harder to pin down because they just don't survive. The artists themselves tell us that they use sketchbooks, but they don't really articulate precisely how, or the the exact mechanism by which they got really, really good at drawing and painting. So Giotto, I like to think of him as being the first person who could paint your portrait in Europe and it really looked like you. And certainly around his time, a lot of things happened in art which I don't think could have happened without sketchbooks.
Yeah, it never even occurred to me that that would have such a huge impact. I mean, here in Silicon Valley, we talk all about, prototypes and the importance of, doing these very, very low cost experiments, right?
Yeah.
And one of the metaphors I like to talk about is how sports have changed due to mm, the ability to do lots of practice. So, for instance, in um, downhill acrobatic skiing, I don't even know what it's called. The old school folks would have to break a bunch of bones in order to learn some moves. And now what they do is they practice with all of these cushions surrounding
Hmm.
the slopes. So you can essentially make a mistake and then get back up 5 minutes later and make another mistake. And so now you have 20-year-olds winning gold medals when you had to be like in your 30s 20
Yeah.
years ago
To
to
have, to have
win
just done
medals.
the repetitions and
Yeah,
broken all the bones. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
right.
But it's one of these
So
unexpected things as well. No one made a notebook, or no one bound paper up together in a book form, thinking it would be a sketchbook, thinking that it would
mhm,
become an artist's training tool. It's an accidental thing. I'm absolutely positive.
mhm. Well, you go way back to the Renaissance, and you talk about the importance of accounting, right? Of all things, and the financial books, and how the business was completely transformed by the ability to record the transactions. I mean, I think that the early cuneiform tablets were also devised in order
Yeah.
to keep records, right?
Yeah, and of course that's what matters to people, isn't it? It's their taxes and their stock and their sales. But what you have there with those ancient cuneiform things, for instance, is what you'd call inventory accounting. When
Right.
you've got a stack of barrels of oil or sacks of grain, whatever it is you have, and then you have a pile of coins, and one goes down and the other one goes up. And it's very simple and clear. What they do with notebooks when they get hold of them is they play with much more complicated concepts. So you have essentially algebraic opposition. Have you studied accountancy bookkeeping yourself, or reading balance sheets,
I,
things
I've,
like that?
I've taught accounting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So so you have this baffling thing
But,
whereby
but I'll say this,
more cash means a debit.
most accountants nowadays aren't spending time with folks like Leonardo da Vinci. So back then, Luca
No,
Pacioli and da Vinci were like tight. I mean, that you don't see that today.
no, absolutely. But and so accountancy is difficult, abstract concepts which you have to really wrestle with. It's very hard to keep it all in your head, and particularly if you're dealing with multiple commodities, multiple currencies. payment terms, interest rates, and you're working in a partnership or a company for the first time. They invent companies at this point. Or you're dealing on a futures market because they were buying and selling wool years into the future. All of these kind of financial innovations, which gave us what we call the commercial revolution first, but which then morphs into capitalism as we know it, and it still functions today. These are a direct result of having ledgers which you can really crunch numbers in, and also treat numbers in a kind of abstract algebraic way, which you just can't do if you're doing it with an abacus, for instance.
Yeah, I think you quoted somebody in the book, I can't remember who said that the invention of the ledger books finally enabled them to sleep at night because they didn't
Yeah,
have to, keep everything.
that
I
was
mean, I think
Pacioli.
it's
Yeah.
true. Yeah, it's true for all of us. I mean, before you go to bed, if you put all your thoughts down and your to-do list down, then you can sleep, and because you don't have to focus on remembering all that stuff.
And it was really interesting when I was researching this book. Like, the art historians never talk about the history of sketchbooks. Couldn't find anything about the history of the sketchbook at that period. Ditto the historians of literature, for instance. They didn't really talk about writers' notebooks going back to that time. But the economists, the historians of the Florentine economy and the coming of the florin and bills of exchange and things like this, medieval trade, they know all about ledgers and they love them. It was the one corner of history where they've actually written about notebooks in a serious way before. So for me to come across that, which I did fairly early in the process, was a real sort of boost for me. It was a real vote of confidence that, I'm onto something here. The economists have got there first. No one reads the history of accountancy, unfortunately. Maybe you do, but so it really gave me some belief that there was a story to be told.
But there's also both in in literature and in accounting, there's this notion that you have multiple books, right? So you have one book where you are kind of taking things down in the moment. And then you have these other books, which are kind of published later that consolidate everything, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a process which you see in all kind of uh, industries, actually. Exactly, where you write down the note at the time, so you forget it, so you don't forget it, and so that whoever you're with can witness it or sign it as well if you're doing business. And then you go away and you process it into different things. So you might sell some wool on the spot, and then you take that away, and you have one book which deals with your wool account, and one book which deals with your account for that customer, and so you would transfer the transaction in different ways to those. But then that process is exactly the same as you say when you're drafting as a writer. Petrarch is a great example of this, the Italian poet who was around at the same time. He marks his pages of his drafts in the same way as the accountants of the period struck through the lines which they'd transferred to their ledgers. So you can see that he's drafting consciously in the same way as an accountant of that era is. But then 500 years later, you've got Darwin sailing around the world on HMS Beagle, and his pocket notebooks, which are the tiny, tiny notebooks which he takes ashore when he's looking at iguanas and finches and the Galapagos or the Brazilian rainforest or the Andes. He does it on foot with these tiny notebooks, really the smallest things, smaller than your phone probably. But then he goes back to the Beagle where he's got proper, more expansive notebooks. He writes them up. He transfers his crappy notes into something more lucid, and he then can refer to the little library that he has on board, and he can transform them into something much more sophisticated. So there's very often this sort of two-step process where, like you say, you're moving from one notebook to another.
Well, I find it interesting that some creative artists, they want to preserve the process, right? And others,
Yeah,
they kind of want to just flush it down the toilet, right? Because
yeah,
they're not thinking about the historians and the people who are, going to find the process as interesting as the final result. Picasso seems to be one of these people that wanted to preserve sort of all the
yes,
raw materials and everything for a legacy.
yeah. Yeah, and he absolutely knew its value. There was a great story of I think it was an electrician. It was an electrician or a plumber who had done some work on Picasso's house when he was an old man. And about 30 years after Picasso's death, he pops up with a box of sketchbooks and say, "Hey, Picasso just gave me these." And of course he'd stolen them. He'd made off with them, and then he'd waited until the statute of limitations had passed before he popped up with the notebooks. And of course, the story was completely bogus. Picasso would never have given anything like that away. He knew perfectly well, which is why he held on to it. He held on to it for 70 years, his early sketchbooks.
Mhm.
But then you're quite right. A lot of people don't value it at all. But I think the same is with the people who receive art. Like, I love looking at sketchbooks and work in progress. I love that part of a gallery exhibition where it shows the diary or the preliminary work. I know people who just fixate on the finished painting and don't care about the process at all. So it cuts both ways.
Well, I mean, it seems like Da Vinci, everything was work in progress, right? I mean,
Yeah,
the tiny tip of the iceberg of the finished works is
yeah,
dwarfed by all of the other stuff, right? All of the just kind of speculation, brainstorming, doodling, and so forth.
yeah. And he could not finish anything. The Mona Lisa, poor woman, she was only just out of her teens, I think, when he actually started painting her. And she was well into her 30s when he died, and he hadn't given her the portrait, so he just carted it around with him and carried on tinkering with it. Yeah, so he was very bad at finishing things, which I think is one reason why in his lifetime he didn't go into print, which he could have done very easily. He knew all the right people. He was very well connected in that world. um, and the idea of him having got just one of his treatises into book form, edited and typeset and for everyone to read is kind of tragic that he didn't get himself together to do that. But he was just too impatient. He couldn't finish anything and he had to move on to the next thing.
He needed an editor to be hassling him, right? Like I'm sure that,
He absolutely
that
did.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
and
Thames and
the letters, people were hassling him all the time. uh
right.
so the his various uh clients would get so exasperated at the length of time it took him to supply anything. They'd be sending friendly priests just to hassle him, knock on the door, and they'd be like, this guy is impossible, he's awful. But he was a genius. Everyone knew he was a genius. That was kind of his job. And so they had to sort of lump it.
Now there are a couple different time periods and places that had distinctive types of notebook ideas, right? And you start by talking about the zibaldone, right? And I guess this was
Yeah,
a big movement, right? And people would um, record random thoughts and ideas in these books. And it seems like these books, they were intended for other people to read at some point, right?
they
Or
certainly
were they?
weren't private. What you've got to
Yeah.
think is this is the 1300s again, and it's Florence again. Or rather through to the 1500s as well. They're around for a long time. But this is the age before print. So you've got people who are very literate, who they love to read, but there aren't any printed books. So what you can do, you can go and pay a copyist or a scribe to copy a book for you. Very, very expensive. You have to wait for it, and then you have one book. Or you get a notebook and you just copy out things which you like. So you're making your own greatest hits of literature. The things that you're going to return to, the things that you love, that are fun, that are good to read aloud. And this is your Zibaldone. And it becomes, nearly everyone seems to have them in Florence at this time. So they collect poems and Aesop's fables and prayers and songs. And if there's sort of legal announcements or public events at the time, they might write them down. They have little
It's
bits
like
of
a
the
scrapbook.
classics. Sorry?
It's like a scrapbook almost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like a written scrapbook. And a lot of the time they are drawing in it as well. They're doodling, either illustrating the story or making a picture of something that they've seen around the place. But they're so personal and they're completely disorganized, which is one of the things I love about them. They're completely haphazard and they're absolutely unique. But you also get the idea that they're a way in which literature can go viral, because you would know what your neighbor had in his, or sometimes her, Zibaldone. If they had a chunk of Dante, which you liked, you could go, oh, I'll just copy that into mine. And then your brother or your cousin or your aunt does it, and suddenly Dante is spreading through the town, and everyone knows who Dante is, or has a chunk of him in their book, even though there's no printing at the time. And so and we know this from wills at the time in Florence, most people in Florence, when they died, even if they were from quite humble backgrounds, cobblers or whatever, most people left a book in their will, a book or two. And that's astonishing in medieval Europe. That just doesn't happen in other places at all, because In other places, if you want to participate in literature at all, it's either completely oral, you're going to hear someone recite a poem or more likely sing a poem, or you're really, really high end and you're buying what we would call an illuminated manuscript, from a professional scribe or a copyist. And most normal people would never have been able to do that. So you've got this pocket of super literate people in a really basically illiterate Europe. And I just love the idea of everyone sharing poems and snippets from the classics and things just because they loved them.
So if you went over to someone's house, would they have this thing kind of sitting out for you to peruse? Is that how it would work?
I get that I can't answer that yes or no, but certainly there was nothing too private about them. And people are always writing their names in their Zibaldoni. There's like, this belongs to so and so.
Mhm.
And sometimes they'll argue with it. So, for instance, if a father dies, he leaves his Zibaldoni to one son, and then the other son will step in and write in it, "No, it belongs to me now." That happens on a couple of occasions. So you can sort of trace its ownership. Um, so certainly within the family, they weren't private. And I guess you would, if you were friendly at all with anyone, you would know about the Zibaldoni, because no one wrote anything intimate down in them. It was stuff like
Mhm.
recipes as well was a big thing, cures for flu, or a lame horse or things like that. um, no one ever wrote anything down which they'd really want to hide. They weren't like intimate diaries at all, so there was nothing you'd want to hide from your neighbors, except very rarely you find Zibaldoni which are a little bit fruity, a little bit erotic or cheeky. um, but those are in the minority.
Now, did Florence and the surrounding area, I mean, did they become the centers of literacy purely because of culture, or was it in part due to their knowledge of this paper making technology?
I think it's a mixture of things. Uh, the main driver which people always point to is the cassato, which is the annual tax return. If you live in Florence, every independent person has to complete their tax return in full themselves every year and submit it. So that drives, apparently, according to the historians, that really drives literacy. But then I think if you have to learn how to read and write in order to complete your tax return, there are so many fun things you can do with reading in particular, that I think you would naturally then turn it to enjoying literature and writing poems down and sharing them. And then when it becomes sort of embedded in the culture, I think probably after 2 or 3 generations, then it's really hard for it to get out, because then it's accepted that, like, everyone will have a Zibaldoni, for instance. Everyone will know a few lines of Dante. Everyone will have a really good knowledge of Aesop's fables or Ovid's Metamorphosis, things like that. And then they teach them at school. So I guess it's a cultural thing, but it probably has its roots in really boring tax returns.
But you also have to have easily accessible and affordable, high quality paper, right?
Well, of
In
course,
order
yeah,
for
and
you.
that enables it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely an enabling factor.
And this technology for paper production, I saw a video coincidentally just a few days ago on paper production, kind of historic paper production. And I didn't realize this, but they would use gelatin, right,
Yeah,
to make the surface sort of printable, right?
yeah.
Instead of but they used to use flour, I guess, in China, and so the whole thing would just become this big molten mush if it ever got wet.
Yeah. So this was the big step forward that the Europeans made, because the Chinese invented paper. Interestingly enough, the Chinese never really used it much for writing on. They used it for other things like wrapping parcels, wrapping packages. But they wrote on bamboo and silk for preference. But then in the Islamic world, they pick up on it a few hundred years later. So the whole huge Islamic Caliphate, which from that point runs all the way from the Caspian Sea to nearly all of Spain, uh, they're big paper users, but they, as you say, are using flour to size their paper to make it smooth. So it's nice and smooth to write on. But as you say, when it gets wet, that flour turns to glue, and it sticks together. I guess, being in relatively dry climates for most of the Islamic world helps that. But when you get into sort of mountainous Italy, it becomes a lot wetter. and quite quickly they hit upon gelatin. So the paper is nice and smooth, and you can write on it, but also sort of water will tend to bead on it rather than soak in immediately. And this is where you get the rag and bone man from, because your rags and bones are your two ingredients of paper at this point. So old undergarments, old linen undershirts and vests and pants, which are then mushed up to make paper, and bones, which are rendered for gelatin, which is painted on as a size.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I guess the church kind of resisted paper initially, because they didn't want the Holy Scripture on this base material, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Rag
Yeah,
stuff.
and there's one of them. I can't remember. I can't remember the name. One of the abbots of Cluny, who was one of the leading. That was a big position in the church at the time. Said he wasn't going to use paper because it had been used for. It had been made out of rags, which had been used to mop up menses. He's very graphic about it. He doesn't mince his words, and that gives you an insight into how medieval women coped. But also a little bit of the opposition to paper. Um, but yeah, it does amaze me, because particularly when printing turns up a couple of 100 years later, suddenly there's this huge appetite for paper, huge demand for it. And people must have got through their linen underwear pretty quickly to generate this much recyclable flax and linen for the paper, but somehow they do.
One of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about in my classes and programs is the diffusion of technologies. And it seems like the scientific technologies diffuse more quickly than some of these more, I guess, know-how technologies. And so there was the technology of making paper, but then there was this technology of accounting. And it seems like the technology for making paper escaped to the confines of Florence
Yeah.
before the knowledge of how to do debits and credits, right, which took a while longer. I was amazed when you described the story of Colbert and how the knowledge of accounting in the public sector. I mean, I studied this stuff back in graduate school, but it hadn't occurred to me that the knowledge of accounting was so primitive, right, within
Yeah.
the French state. And it was really Colbert that helped spread it, and that the kings had absolutely no clue. This was not part of Louis XIV's education by by Mazarin. He never learned how to look at accounts and debits and credits as part of his upbringing.
No, but he did in later life. Actually, he became
Yeah.
very interested in it, and he wanted everything boiled down, as really top tier executives always do. They always want it on one sheet of paper, don't they? But he could, in the end, he could read accounts, and he knew when he was being sold a pup. But he learned the hard way, because in his youth, he was really comprehensively ripped off as king of France. But I think it is really interesting the way, as you say, the notebook is hardware, and then you have all this software, and the software percolates in a quite different way. Accountancy is known as the Italian method of bookkeeping.
Mhm.
For hundreds of years, it's just thought that Italians can do it, and no one else really can. It's not strictly speaking true. They get quite good at it in Germany fairly fast, but certainly the English were still talking about the Italian method hundreds of years after it had been invented in Italy. But I think there's a parallel with computing here, because computers, you have hardware and software, and all computers, as I understand it, basically get invented by companies like IBM to do accounts with, do business planning and so on, and then the first databases are to do with business as well. No one would have predicted Pixar necessarily, or Photoshop, Creative Suite, things like that. But these are very much how we engage with computers or computing power today, aren't they? You'll sit down and watch an animation, and it's all been made on something which is a direct ancestor of an IBM mainframe, I guess.
Well, you would think that the ease of editing using a computer as opposed to paper would sort of generate more creativity. But
Mm.
it seems like you suggest that there are some reasons to think that when it comes to writing on paper, that unlocks certain types of creativity that you can't get when you work using digital technologies. I mean,
Yeah.
Why is that? I mean, you only touched on it at the end, but that's a fascinating area of research.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's interesting you pick up on it, because I wrote a lot more about it, but the editors, we had a bit of a wrangle about it, and a lot of it was cut.
Mm.
I think the word difficulty is interesting there. You're right; it is much easier to tap into a laptop. It's much easier to edit on a laptop, and it's much easier to word process, produce 1,000 words of text on a laptop. But to make it good takes work. And if the process of writing is a little bit difficult, if you're forced by the labor of handwriting, which is slow and hard work, to actually think through every word carefully as you choose it, as you order it, as you make your sentence, this I think is a really good discipline, and it will give you better quality results. I find it very interesting. I write a diary every day by hand, and like everyone else, I type a huge amount every day on a computer. And I find that when I write by hand, I don't start a sentence until I know how it's going to end.
Mm.
When I type, constantly I'm writing down, starting off with something. Fortunately, oh no, no, today, no, no, he, oh no, that's not right. Constantly starting it again, and no sentence finishes the way I thought it was going to start. Whereas if I'm writing, you have to have subject, verb, object, all the other stuff kind of clear in your head. And that's a really good discipline as a writer, I think. Um, so, and I'm sure that must be true of other people as well. And then there's, when you're note taking as well, there's a real advantage to the physical labor of, you pick a phrase, you pick a sentence, a reference, you excerpt it, you choose it. And because it takes that 2 minutes to write down a long quote or something like that, or longer, and you have to focus on every word as you do it. You can't just Control C, Control V, yeah, or Apple C, Apple V. Uh, all of the quotes you need and just dump them into your document. If you do it by hand, you really digest them, you really get to know them. And that's the best way, I think, to understand something that's been written by someone else, is to copy it out, because you have to really engage with it.
Yeah, it seems like there's two things that could be going on. One is that you need some optimal level of difficulty, right? If it's too difficult and you have a hammer and a chisel, right, that's going to
Yeah.
impede creativity. If it's easy to
Yeah.
just kind of like, you know, grab a bunch of stuff and delete text, it's not good. But there's some optimal level. But there's also something about the physicality, I think, that you were alluding to, like actually
Yeah.
how when you are using your hand and your arm and so forth, it actually lays down things in the brain slightly differently than if you're say typing.
Yeah. And there seems to be, it's all, the brain, as you know, is all about connections. Yeah. It's not about really what one part of the brain does. It's about how different modules in the brain relate to each other. And when you write in a physical notebook, you activate more parts of the brain than when you type. So, for instance, you tend to activate the hippocampus, which is your mental map. And you activate that when you're writing in a notebook. And they reckon this is because a notebook isn't just a thing, it's also a kind of place. And so when you put an idea on the page, you're locating it on this kind of mapped reality, which is the pages of your notebook. And if you think about this, when you're flicking through a notebook, you quite often think to yourself, oh, I know this was on the left side at the bottom. Yeah. Or I know this was in blue, not black. Or I know that it was a doodle in a in a corner of the page. And you don't get that when you're typing. And they think it might be to do with the fact that as you scroll up, or as your document scrolls up the screen away from whatever it is, the leading edge of what you're typing, it just vanishes into the machine.
Mm.
It's just into the box or into your phone or into your iPad. It has no place. Whereas when you've created a notebook, everything has its place, quite literally, and that is reflected in your brain. So that's one example. And then, of course, there's the sort of the different levels of hand-eye coordination, muscle coordination, the sensory perceptions of the notebook or the paper and the pencil in your fingers. All of these things make it a cognitively much richer experience. The best way to understand it, which I can never explain, I can only ever show pictures and just go, you see, is watching people's brains in MRI scans activate as they write compared to as they type. And people type away quite busily with one part of the brain, but then when they're writing by hand, uh, oof, the whole thing lights up like a Christmas tree. Um, Another interesting thing, which this is for note taking. You should try this on your students, because I guess when you're talking in a lecture environment, quite often you must be faced by a lot of laptops, yeah, open in front
Mhm.
of you.
Yeah. We've had huge debate about this, and in some of our programs we ban them.
Oh, well, that's interesting, because a big problem with typing, with laptop typing your notes, is that you can do it as fast as the lecturer speaks. So you go
Mhm.
verbatim. Everything you
Yeah.
say, Greg, they type down. But the problem then is they're not actually engaging with the substance of it, the ideas, the meat of what you're
Right.
saying. They're not processing it. They're merely taking it in down on the page. That's it. And
Well, then you might as
whereas
well
if
just
they
hand out a
write,
transcript, right? You might as well just hand out a transcript. I mean, what's the
yeah,
point of being in
exactly. You
class?
might, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And but if you have a well organized lecture where the ideas come in, they're arranged, there's a little bit of a hierarchy, you're signposting, you're helping them through it, but they'll never be able to keep up with you if they're writing, but they have to
Right.
paraphrase, and they have to discern what's the important thing he's saying here, what's the less important thing. Is the date important in this sentence, or is the idea important, for instance? Um, uh, and so you get much better results. I mean, there's always research on this. I think Princeton did one quite recently. In Japan, they've done a heck of a lot. Um, where if you're writing notes, you tend to process things much, much more effectively than if you're typing them. And it's interesting what you say about the debate continuing. I think there's a pendulum looking for the optimum. My daughter was at a secondary school, a high school, here in the UK, which was actually sponsored by Apple. It was one of the first schools over here where they really embedded the iPad in the curriculum, and they delivered nearly everything digitally if they could, apart from art, basically. Um, so and and it was from my daughter's point of view, she didn't get on with the iPad and constantly broke it, and just she's a tactile person, she likes making things. I mean, it was a write-off. It was just terrible, a really frustrating, annoying experience. My son, who's 8 years younger, on the day he arrived at school, they were issued with laptops with Chromebooks, and my heart sank. And I thought, oh God, here we go
Mm.
again. A year later, they've taken them away from them. They're doing everything by hand. The laptops are in a cupboard at the back of the classroom. So he's 13, 14, and writing in exercise books all the time. And so the pendulum has swung back again. And I think the teachers are much happier. Certainly as a parent, I'm much happier.
Yeah, I used to hand out copies of my slides, my PowerPoint slides in my classes, and most of my slides are just images without words because I find it
Yeah,
difficult to read words and listen at the same time. So I just have images, but I would hand them out so that people could annotate them as
that's
I was
great.
speaking.
That's the best of both worlds. Yeah, because you give them the
Right?
structure, you give them the
Yeah,
prompt.
but then the school, in order to save money, said, you're not allowed to hand out any slides anymore.
Ugh,
and, and and so now they, what are they going to do? Well, they have to bring out their iPads and laptops again, and so I find that to be detrimental to the educational experience. I
yeah.
think having handouts or that have the basic framework, and then you can kind of put some doodles and stuff on there. Well, you talk about a lot of my favorite people like Luca Pacioli, but also Erasmus. And I didn't realize Erasmus, I guess, was the sort of source of these commonplace books. They were the big promoter of
Yeah,
these commonplace
yeah,
books, right?
yeah. So,
And this took off
so
in the
Erasmus,
Germanic
he had,
world.
yeah.
Took off in the
Sorry.
Germany and Holland mostly. Took off in Germany and the Netherlands mostly, right?
Well, took off everywhere. I mean, the thing was, he was just a huge star. He had about 10 or 20 years when some estimates are 10% of books printed in Europe were by or edited by Erasmus. So he was everywhere, and this was the sort of the first, not the first wave of printing, but it was the first wave of printing which really sort of cut through to a wide audience, that generation. And uh, and he had big thoughts about education. He was great friends with John Colet in London, who was a sort of quite serious educationalist at the time, and he came up with the concept of the commonplace book, which is like a more sophisticated Zibaldoni, if you like. It's more organized. Basically, through your school days, you make your own encyclopedia under headwords by taking out the best bits of everything that you read. So you have all the benefits we've been talking about of serious note taking and really engaging with the text, but you make this kind of depending on what you're studying, the headwords might be things like travel or justice or love or God, and you just write down anything interesting under those headwords that you find. It's an amazingly rigorous and, I think, onerous way of learning stuff, but to an incredibly high level. So you have people in the 16th century who go to grammar schools and they're like nothing we see today. The rigor of their education. They speak Latin really seriously by the time they're about 15, or younger. Many of them will speak Greek as well. And they're incredibly well read in history, philosophy, the classics, theology, the Bible. And that's where you get people like Shakespeare from, because they are so used to wrestling with all kinds of ideas from very different sources. The idea, they don't really value originality so much, but they do really value ideas. So if you've got the idea written on the page, they don't care whose it is so much as we do, but they can play with it. And therefore you get sort of situations where Shakespeare can steal a plot from somewhere, but he can steal his imagery from somewhere else. He can mix it up with a verse form which was invented in Italy 200 years before, and bang, you've got the sonnets, or you've got any of his plays basically had stolen plots and loads of Ovid in them, So, but the same applies to Johnson, Marlowe, all of his contemporaries. But also, you've got to remember the audience again, the other side of the equation. All of these people or a lot of them had gone through grammar schools themselves. So when Shakespeare comes up with this stuff, which is really dense, quite difficult to digest, full of ideas, they can cope with it. It's being thrown at them, at high speed in verse, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a bit of Ovid. I recognize that. So you've got this really super educated, creative class and receptive class if you like, at that moment in time. And up to that point, England has been a complete intellectual backwater. So, I mean, thank God for Erasmus, basically, from that point of view.
Well, it's like Montaigne. I mean, same thing. He litters his
Yeah.
essays with these little quotes, and most people would recognize them as being from Cicero or Epictetus or Lucretius or somebody, right?
Yeah. And then and it's exactly that. But he's juxtaposing ideas on a theme. And as you say, he's pulling the ideas all from different places. A lot of people will recognize him. He says, oh, Cicero says this, whereas my washerwoman says that.
Right.
And he invented the essay, the sort of discursive kind of voyage around a subject, hugely popular. I mean, he was really he was a bestseller smash hit across Europe with these essays. I think I've read them fairly recently. They're very readable, a lot of them, even if they don't seem quite so revolutionary anymore, but they were completely revolutionary at the time.
Well, Shakespeare makes an appearance a couple other places. I mean, you said that The Tempest was inspired by all of these. I mean, and I guess Robinson Crusoe later was inspired by these kind of travelogues where, I mean, Marco Polo,
Yeah,
I guess, is the original travelogue, right? But
yeah.
this whole body of literature was super popular during the voyages of discovery and after, right?
Yeah, and there's a curious thing, and I'd love to get to the bottom of it, where people start keeping travel journals hundreds of years before they start keeping journals of their normal day. So
Mm.
Marco Polo is a really good example, actually. Marco Polo was very popular in people's Zibaldoni, but yeah, travel notebooks seem to be really, really important, and then they do spawn Robinson Crusoe, for instance, as really incredibly influential work of literature. People weren't certain 100% if it was fiction when it first came out. It wasn't billed as being either fiction or completely true. There was a certain amount of creative ambiguity, but then people realized fairly quickly that it was fiction, and this old genre of travel writing had been turned into something new.
Well, you mentioned that. I mean, the Zibaldoni and the commonplace books, these really, there was not a lot of introspection and there wasn't a lot of personal information in these things. So we don't really get a good window into the interior lives of these folks. And that really only happened, starting with, I mean, Peeps is the person that everybody points to as sort of the original diarist, right? So why did this whole
Yeah.
kind of diary craze kick in at some point, and I guess it's still with us today.
Uh, well, I can tell you the when and the where, and no one can tell you the why. People have really puzzled away at this. It's in England, we know that, and it's a bit before Peeps. It's around Shakespeare's generation, actually, if people first start keeping diaries. Um, why? We just don't know. And I mean, it's when you start keeping a diary, I don't know if you've ever done it yourself. For most people, it becomes a really satisfying activity and one that they don't want to drop. So that's why people keep it up. But where they got the idea from, why they suddenly started doing it, and it was quite normal, everyday people. It wasn't an upmarket activity at all, keeping a diary. Um, but for some reason, people just started doing it. And then around the time of Peeps, it spreads out from England into the rest of Europe. So people start keeping them in France and Holland and such like. Um, and then you have really sophisticated diarists like Peeps, who just writes down absolutely everything, but is also uh, he has no filter, he has no censor, so you really get his entire life, which is wonderful. And he is, whenever you read anything about the history of that period, I remember once I was doing a bit of art history research, and there was something about a style of a woman's hat in Amsterdam, and it said, "Oh, we know that this hat was from this point because there's a source." Okay, go to the footnotes. What's the source? It was Pepys' diary. And the same thing happens again and again because he was such a completist. He is the source on practically everything in his lifetime or in that decade when he was keeping a diary, because he just wrote it all down. Dutch women's hats, um, his discovering pornography, um, the conversations he had with the Duke of York about stocking ships to go to war with the Dutch, etc., etc. It was just an incredible variety of a very rich life he led, and he wrote it all down.
Well, when they say that when you're writing, you always have an audience in mind. I mean, who's the audience for diaries? Is it generally your future self?
That's an interesting question. I think it's for me when I write. It's for me in the moment. What I want to do, and I write a diary quite assiduously, is to force myself to reflect.
Mm.
And by putting things in words, by putting feelings in words, you master your emotions. Essentially, it's a mindful practice in that sense. If you're writing down about how angry you were about something, you have to analyze it and sort of control that emotion. But also when I'm writing about my relationships with other people, you're forced to consider their point of view when you're writing down what they say or what they do, and you're like, okay, well maybe he had a point, that sort of thing. So I find it a really healthy exercise in the moment. And I guess when I think of who's going to read them in future, I think of my kids after I'm gone,
Mm.
or maybe their kids, if that ever happens. Um, in the same way as I read my grandfather's diaries. But I think then maybe after that generation, after the grandchildren, I think there will be a drop off of interest. I don't think that they'd find great granddad Roland's diaries particularly interesting. And at that point, I'd rather like them to go into an archive somewhere where they can sit alongside lots of other old diaries and
And
just
you did
collect.
access your grandfather's diaries, right?
Yeah. I got an interest. This is really interesting. He seems to have kept diaries for quite a long time. And by chance, I came into three of them about 20 years after he'd died. I've got no idea why. They were just separate from the others. And they were fascinating. And the rest of them are still around with various aunts. And I think that they think I'm a little too interested. But, I've been through them, and I really have read them cover to cover, despite his appalling handwriting, and despite the fact that really nearly every day individually is quite dull. Nothing apart from when his appendix bursts, or he meets a new girl, or Hitler invades Lithuania where he lives. It's pretty much standard stuff about ships coming and going, and he lost a hat once. But it's fascinating still. You do get a picture of this life, even with very pithy diary entries over time. So, from my point of view, I feel I've got a relationship with this guy who died when I was 6, and I feel that we would have got on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of memoirs. But when you read a memoir, it's been polished, it's been processed, right? So,
Mm.
like Patrick Lee Fermer's memoirs. I mean, they're fantastic. I'm not sure if I would enjoy the kind of primary materials as much, right?
Yeah.
'Cause it would be disjointed. There might not be any connective tissue. It might just be a series of bullet entries and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And he's a really good example because his famous books about his epic walk across Europe between the woods and the water and so on, A Time of Gifts, they were all published in the 70s. And he'd been on this walk in the late 30s. He had really spent the intervening 40 years, or much of them, polishing and polishing and polishing and revising and revising and revising. And probably, I think when you read it, you're thinking to yourself, does this 18-year-old boy really have such enormous chunks of Shakespeare that he can basically declaim Hamlet as he's walking through the Black Forest, this sort of picture he paints? Did he really? Well, I don't know, maybe he did, but I think there's a lot of invention in there. So yeah, you're right, the process definitely turns them into better books, definitely, but you lose a bit of the truth on the way.
Well, your description of your diary practice is consistent with Pennebaker's theories, right? About the
Yeah,
therapeutic
completely. Yeah.
effect of diary writing. It's surprising that
Yeah.
it isn't more widespread as a, I don't know, prescription, right? You go into the psychiatrist with all sorts of issues, and they, I mean, it's certainly a lot cheaper than doing psychotherapy, right? You just buy a little
Yeah.
book, a little moleskin, and start writing.
And no side effects, you know? Yeah,
Yeah,
if it doesn't work for you, what's the worst? You've given it 5 minutes of your life. That's the worst thing that can happen. But yeah, you've got this thing which is incredible for PTSD. It's incredible, I'm sure, for all kinds of unprocessed trauma. What really, this is another thing which I had to fight to keep in because my editors couldn't quite get the value of it. If you're going for an operation, if you are going to have a benign tumor removed in 2 weeks' time, write a diary or just write about powerful emotional hurt that you've experienced. Write a trauma, what do you call it? An emotional disclosure diary. Just write your emotions down on the page. You don't have to show them to anyone. You can put them in the bin, throw them on the fire, keep them forever. It doesn't matter. Just get them out of your head on the page about 2 weeks before your operation, and you will heal twice as fast. Your body loses so much stress and it's so
Mm.
much better prepared for the trauma of whatever procedure you have that you will recover 2 weeks twice as fast. And they measure this with they've done it properly. They do it with they did it with biopsies. So they had a huge group of people, all of whom were getting exactly the same injury. So they had a very good control. And then they measured the proteins and the hormones and the things which to do with stress and physical recovery, um, different kinds of white blood cells, all of that. And I find this absolutely astonishing that everyone doesn't do it. But, patient diaries were very similar. Patient diaries were around for 30 years before they caught on outside Denmark. And they are an incredible thing for helping patients recover from comas and the trauma of ICU intubement. Um, so hopefully the therapeutic diary will just become a more common thing over the next 30 years. But as Pennebaker says, no one can make any money from it. So he's not
Right.
optimistic it's going to happen. I have little hope.
Can't patent it. But it seems like it's actually a modern version of a practice that you described in the book, where people would kind of write their sins down, right, on maybe one of these
Yeah,
table books. And then when they got forgiven, they could just wipe the slate clean, right?
what exactly?
Right?
Yeah,
And then start all
and
over,
and I
start
looked at
sitting
these.
again.
Yeah, I looked at these and I thought, oh, these look like the first diaries. And then I looked a bit closer, and they're not really, because they're never. The whole idea with these things is that you show them to your spiritual mentor at the end of the day. You show them to. I
Mhm.
think they were mostly kept by monks in the early days, and then actually later on, I think the Jesuits had something to do with them. So you would keep this record of your sins, uh, and you'd show it to the abbot at the end of the day, and he would say, "Yes, well, you're very sinful. What are you going to do about it?" And you'd confess and be absolved and wipe the slate clean, as you say. I'm not sure
Mhm.
how good that sort of beating yourself up is for your mental health. My instinct is probably that that's not great, but And certainly Newton, for instance, kept that kind of record of his sins. And he was a really cranky, unhappy individual. So I don't think that helped him.
Well, he never got the slate cleaned, I guess. You gotta
No,
purge all that stuff, right?
no. And
So,
he just took it. He seems to have taken it on everyone he knew.
yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned these table books. They kind of reminded me a bit of, I used to get these books from The Economist every year. They were, I think Let's made them, but they were these diaries, calendar diaries, and they fit in your suit pocket. And they were leather bound with little gold trim, and The Economist would sell them. It had a tube map in it, even though I didn't live in London, never went to London, but I was like, well, I know how to get around on the tube. And it had,
Mm.
which years were the best years for Burgundy. That was a super helpful fun fact. And then a couple conversion tables, right? Like imperial
Public
units into
holidays all around the
public
world.
holidays. And yeah, and especially, you got to know public holidays in the UK if you live in the US. But then it had and I have somewhere in my house, I have probably 20 years of these things. And this is what preceded Apple Calendar. And so I resisted for a really long time switching to Google Calendar. Now, of course, I can't imagine living without Google Calendar, but having the ability to kind of just view your life, both present,
Mm.
future, and past inside these books, it was tough to give up.
They're amazing little things. Yeah, I love that. I always thought the tube map thing was very strange because I grew up in London, so I know the tube anyway. But the one place you really don't need a tube map is on the tube because you're just surrounded by them. Yeah, you look up,
Yeah.
there's one in front of you always. Yeah, you always
Mhm.
know where you are.
Now, you mentioned towards the end of the book this guy Bob Graham, and I didn't know anything about this, but he was a compulsive note taker and notebook collector, and you said that, and I don't remember any of this, but you said that he was vilified or pathologized, right?
Yeah,
And that he had board his campaign for president because everyone thought he was a weirdo
yeah,
for keeping track of everything. Um,
yeah.
do
So
people?
he
I mean, is that
obsessively
general? Is
logged.
that
Yeah.
general consensus? Do you think that sentiment is widespread?
I think it would be these days if anyone sort of confessed to it as he did. The thing was that he was from Florida and he was very well known in the Florida media pack for this habit. It was just something that he did. Everyone knew that he took notes all the time. But he was also a very popular figure, very effective, I think, governor, then senator in Florida, if I've got that right. Um, and they just got used to it. And it was when he appeared on the national stage that people who were suddenly exposed to him had no idea who he was, and they saw it happening. They thought it was very strange, and he was, as you say, pathologized from a distance, which I think is half fair. There clearly there's something going on in his head which is quite unusual. This need to write it down because it was compulsive. He logged every minute of every single day for years and years. Every cereal he had for breakfast, every hotel room number, all of it. Um, but at the same time, it did him no harm. So it's not really a disorder if it does you no harm, but it's definitely an odd thing. But by comparison with the politicians we have around us today, Bob Graham, in his prime, seems to have been a great guy. Wouldn't have minded a few more Bob Grahams around, but such is life.
Well, nowadays everyone is using apps and things to track their exercise history, right? Their heart rate
Mm,
history, their location history, and everything else. But it happens all in the background, and so people aren't actually going through the process of recording it, interpreting it, and making sense of it. So it
no,
seems to serve a very, very different purpose than
yeah.
what
Well,
note taking
ultimately, it's
used to.
data to monetize, isn't it?
Yeah.
These this is what they exist for. They want to know that we're jogging past Starbucks so that they can tell us, you're
Mhm.
about to go past Starbucks or whatever it is. I keep little logs of things like that in my diary, so I'll write down tonight how many lengths I swam this morning, that sort of thing, um,
Yeah.
rather than use Strava.
Well, the one reason why I have not become a good diary keeper. I just have piles of notes and random notebooks everywhere. I don't know how you wind up retrieving this stuff. Once it's written down, it's in some pile somewhere. I'm too disorganized to keep track. But Roland, thank you so much for joining me. This is a really, really fun book. It's called The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. Check it out. Thanks for joining.
Thanks very much, Greg. It's been a real pleasure.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.